The other day, I was honored to be flanked by Colin Powell and General Norman Schwarzkopf, who stood by my side and agreed with me. They said we can, even though we're the strongest military, that if we don't do something quickly, if we don't have a clearer vision of the military, if we don't stop extending our troops all around the world in nation-building missions, then we're going to have a serious problem coming down the road, and I'm going to prevent that. The results of the election, as Vice President is, it's time for the man to go. And it means that the United States must have a strong diplomatic hand with our friends in NATO. That's why it's important to make sure our alliances are as strong as they possibly can be to keep the pressure on Mr. Milosevic. I don't want to try to put our troops in all places at all times. I don't want to be the world's policeman. I want to be the world's peacemaker by having a military of high morale and a military that's well equipped. Like he is. Here's your question was deployment. It must be in the national interests, must be in our vital interest whether we ever send troops. The mission must be clear. Soldiers must understand why we're going. The force must be strong enough so that the mission can be accomplished, and the exit strategy needs to be well defined. I'm concerned that we're over-deployed around the world. See, I think the mission has somewhat become fuzzy.
Yes, my sixth grade class at St. Clair School wanted to ask, of all these promises you guys are making and all the pledges, will you keep them when you're in office?
Yes. I am a person who keeps promises. And you know, we've heard a lot from the governor about not much being done in the last 8 years, as if the promises that I made 8 years ago have not been kept. I think the record shows otherwise. We have gone from the biggest deficits 8 years ago to the biggest surpluses in history today. Instead of high unemployment, we now have the lowest African-American unemployment, the lowest Latino unemployment ever measured, 22 million new jobs, very low unemployment nationally. Instead of ballooning the debt and multiplying it 4 times over, we have seen the debt actually begun to be paid down. Here are some promises that I'll make to you now. I will balance the budget every year. I will pay down the debt every year. I will give middle-class Americans tax cuts, meaningful ones. And I will invest in education, health care, protecting the environment, and retirement security. We both made promises in this campaign. I promise you I will keep mine. Let me tell you about one of the governors. He has promised $1 trillion out of the Social Security Trust Fund for young working adults to invest and save on their own. But he's promised seniors that their Social Security benefits will not be cut, and he's promised the same $1 trillion to them. So this is the show me state. Reminds me of the line from the movie, Show Me the Money. Which one of those promises will you keep and which will you break, Governor?
Governor Bush? Thank you for your question. There's an old high school debating trick, which is to answer something and then attack your opponent at the end. You asked about promises. You were promised that Medicare would be reformed and that Social Security would be reformed. You were promised a middle-class tax cut in 1992. It didn't happen. There's too much bitterness in Washington. There's too much wrangling. It's time to have a fresh start. One of the reasons I was successful as the governor of Texas is because I didn't try to be all things to all people. When I campaigned in a race, a lot of folks didn't think I could win, including, by the way, my mother. I said I'd do 4 things: tort reform, education reform, welfare reform, and juvenile justice reform. And I won, and I had the will of the people in my state behind me. And then I brought folks together to get it done. And that's what we need, I think, in this election. To me, that's what it's all about. I know, listen, I'm sure your sixth grade kids are listening, because these guys will say anything to get elected. But there's a record, and that's what I hope people look at. And one of my promises is going to be Social Security reform, and you bet we need to take $1 trillion out of that $2.4 trillion surplus. Now remember, Social Security revenue exceeds expenses up until 2015. People are going to get paid. But if you're a younger worker, if you're younger, you better hope this country thinks differently. Otherwise, you're going to be faced with huge payroll taxes or reduced benefits. And you bet we're going to take $1 trillion of your own money and let you invest it under safe guidelines so you get a better rate of return on the money than the paltry 2% that the federal government gets for you today. That's one of my promises. But it's going to require people to bring both Republicans and Democrats together to get it done. That's what it requires. There was a chance to get this done. There was bipartisan approach, but it's been rejected. I'm going to bring them together.
To both of you on this subject, there are other questions that also go to this skepticism, not necessarily about you, but all people in politics. Why is that?
Well, first of all, Jim, I'd like to respond to what the governor just said, because the $1 trillion that has been promised to young people, the American spirit, and make our future what our founders dreamed it could be. We can.
Right. Governor Bush, 2 minutes.
I'll tell you what I hear. A lot of people are sick and tired of the bitterness in Washington, D.C., and therefore they don't want any part of politics. They look at Washington and see people pointing fingers and casting blame and saying one thing and doing another. There's a lot of young folks saying, you know, why do I want to be involved with this mess? And what I think needs to happen in order to encourage the young to become involved is to shoot straight, is to set aside the partisan differences and set an agenda that will make sense. Medicare, I know you talked about it, but Medicare is relevant for all of us, young and old alike. We better get it right now. Tax reform is relevant for old and young alike. I don't think it's the issues that turn kids off. I think it's the tone. I think it's the attitude. I think it's a cynicism in Washington, and it doesn't have to be that way. Before I decided to run, I had to resolve 2 issues in my mind. One, could our family endure all this business? And I came to the conclusion that our love was strong enough to be able to do it. And the other was, could an administration change the tone in Washington, D.C.? And I believe the answer is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be asking for your vote. That's what happened in Texas. We worked together. There's a man here in this audience named Hugo Berlanga. He's the chairman of the Health Committee. He came here for a reason, to tout our record on health in Texas. He's a Democrat. I didn't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat. What I cared about is, could we work together? That's what Washington, D.C. needs. And finally, sir, to answer your question, it needs somebody in office who'll tell the truth. That's the best way to get people back in the system.
Governor Bush, Norma Kirby has the next question.